event, we'll look more closely at FareShare, the research we've undertaken with them, and show the short film that we've created around the community food scene at the moment. Great, okay. So I've seen that Anna Davies has joined the call.
Hi, Jordan.
Hello.
Hi, everyone.
So thank you for joining us today, Anna. So really looking forward to your keynote speech today. So to introduce Anna, she is a Professor of Geography, Environment and Society at Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland, where she directs the Environmental Governance Research Group and is a member of the Trinity Centre for Future Cities. She is widely published in the fields of geography, environmental policy and sustainability, as a member of the Royal Irish Academy and a governing board member of the International Science Council. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Anna Davies, our first keynote speaker. And do you have a presentation to share, Anna?
I do. Thanks, Jordan. Thanks for that introduction. I'm going to try and share my screen now. Do I have the authority to do that?
There we go. Have a go now. Stop sharing my screen. Great. Can you see that?
Can you see my screen? That's great. Thanks a million. I'm just going to start the presentation. So thanks, Jordan. Thanks for that introduction and morning to everybody. I've got a back to school cold with my kids thanks to the new term, but I'm delighted that they're back in school. So I'll struggle through and hopefully it won't disrupt the presentation today too much. It's really a pleasure to be here at the Future Food Symposium. I think now more than ever, it's very important that we think about sustainable food futures. And I guess I'd like to present an overview of a body of research that's preoccupied most of my waking hours over the past 5 years in the guise of the ShareCity project. Through ShareCity, we've been exploring contemporary practices of food sharing initiatives with a focus on those which have an online presence, using different forms of ICT to conduct, manage and communicate the work that they do. I'll only be able to skim the surface of the work today. I want to focus on the final formal end product that's only just come together in the last couple of months, the ShareCity Manifesto for sustainable food sharing. So with that in mind, please do check out the project website, sharecity.ie, to explore the vast spread of tools and publications that are being produced, and do get in touch with me if you'd like to discuss any of the project and its findings. The project has been very much a team effort with a band of smart and committed researchers who've helped translate my initial ideas into action over the past 5 years. And we hope our efforts will contribute to the development of a more sustainable urban food system and contribute to the wider goal of sustainable food futures. ShareCity was born from the findings of previous research examining practices of sustainable household consumption in a project called Consensus, which pushed back against the encroaching individualism around food consumption policy and flagged the importance of collective acts around food as both actual and promising practices for more sustainable food systems. The practice-orientated backcasting methodology and the living laboratory work that Consensus developed inspired the structure and conceptual framing of ShareCity, which combines social practice approaches with insights from diverse economies and transitions research. But in ShareCity, the focus was both narrowed to consider practices of ICT mediated food sharing and also broadened to move beyond the home to focus on sharing within communities of place and practice. ShareCity also focuses not just on matters of sustainable consumption, but also sustainable production and disposal, representing the reality that food sharing occurs across the food system. As this body of food sharing activity has not been mapped before, this was the goal at the first stage of our research, and we spent 5 months collating more than 4,000 food sharing initiatives with active websites, apps, interactive social media in 100 urban areas worldwide. We coded and sorted these initiatives and created an open access interactives, a searchable database, which has now been viewed over 17,000 times from 93 countries, and this is still available from our website. This mapping provided a sample population from which to identify sites for more in-depth research with the initiatives and wider stakeholders in particular locations. And 9 cities were explored, and case study initiatives across activities of growing, cooking, eating and redistributing food were examined through participation in acts of food sharing, both on and offline, and through interviews and workshops with wider stakeholders. This research formed the foundation for two further activities. First, the examination of sustainability impacts, which led to the co-production of a sustainability impact assessment toolkit called Shareit. And second, the consideration of the impact of policy and governance on the future of food sharing activities. We're still working on these last two activities post-scarcity, and I'll discuss them a bit later. And I'm also hoping, a bit of a plug here, I'm hoping to recruit a researcher for a 12-month position to work here in Dublin with me on these and future initiatives. So if you know of anyone that's interested, please just tell them to get in touch with me. It'd be great to hear from them. So a manifesto for sustainable food sharing. I guess it's hard to design an exit strategy for a research project that has raised as many questions as answers, and in an area where activities, policies, and contexts are constantly evolving, even before COVID-19. But I was keen to try and consolidate findings in a way which was digestible, and the Manifesto for Sustainable Food Sharing is my first attempt to do that. So why manifesto? Well, manifestos take many forms, typically used in a political context, and certainly Shareit identified the highly political nature of and surrounding context for food sharing. However, this manifesto is not a blueprint or a doctrine for food sharing initiatives, but a wider set of interconnected high-level principles that underpin the most holistically sustainable practice of food sharing we encountered. It's being developed as a means to engage not just food sharers, but also with those who interact and govern them. The manifesto should be read as a living document, a communication device, a means to consolidate and represent diverse work, with each element linked to project outputs. Essentially, it's a springboard to stimulate further engagement, critique, research, and action, and a tentative answer to the question, what do you believe, based on years of empirical research work with food sharing. We found that sustainable food sharing initiatives are often accessible, easy to access, understand, and engage with, accountable, open and transparent, fostering trusting relationships, attentive to the impacts that they create, valuing positive, caring relations, and deeply connected, virtually or physical, to their communities. There's a whole host of other principles here that you can see on this screen. I'm not going to go through them word by word again. This information is all available on our website if you'd like to interrogate the material a bit further. But it's important to note that not all of the principles can be enacted by food sharing initiatives alone. Many require the interaction of a wide range of actors. Food sharing cannot be connected, for example, without others to connect with, and it can't be embedded within a community without a community to embed it within. So in today's presentation, I'll focus on just two of these principles that will be key in shaping the future of food sharing in relation to wider actors, and which are, as a result, perhaps the hardest to attain. First, the principle of being supported. This focuses on the need for food sharing to work with governments and others that respect and support the values sharing creates. This may seem like a truism to flag this principle, but it is a fundamental nature that demands that it's included. It emerged as a recurrent theme through a range of research settings, from mapping to featuring exercises. In the mapping phase, for example, we found a concentration of active and persistent food sharing initiatives in settings where local governments are committed to sustainability in a range of different ways, perhaps being a member of an international alliance such as the Sharing Cities Network or the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, or where local authorities had a progressive stance on food policy, for example, through the development of food policy councils and similar initiatives. In the Sharing Futures workshop we conducted, international stakeholders from policy, academia, and practice all flagged the challenges of trying to enact sustainable food sharing of any kind in the absence of a supportive governing context, and in particular, supportive policies around space and place. Land use planning policy and implementation were specifically called out for their pivotal role in allocating land and facilities for sharing activities, with participants flagging the pervasive nature and negative impacts of insecure tenure that food sharing initiatives are often allocated, if they are lucky enough to be allocated anything at all. And despite visible levels of under-occupancy and vacancy in all the cities that we examined. On the back of our fieldwork and Sharing Futures workshop, we've worked with an artist, Fiammetta Gandini from Riva Illustrations, to create 3 different visualizations of alternative urban food sharing futures. I'll only be able to flick through them now, so apologies for that, but you can view them at your leisure again on our website. We're really happy with them and have created an animation to aid viewers through each, as we are currently trialling these as a means to build dialogue with different stakeholders, in particular young people and policymakers. We're presenting this work in more detail later this month on the 16th of September at the International Transdisciplinarity Conference. It's certainly clear that for many locations, food sharing is not currently supported sufficiently by many local governments to be considered a sustainable practice. In part, this can be attributed to the invisibility of the impacts that food sharing initiatives can have. But it's also clear that in many locations, the impacts created by food sharing are simply not valued within the prevailing systems of allocation, which leads me on to the second principle that I want to address today. The second and interrelated principle is that of being valuable. It was clear to us that in many locations, the impacts created by food sharing are rarely seen as valuable within the prevailing system of resource allocation, at least not valuable enough to prioritise or stabilise initiatives and their outcomes through the long term. We wanted to explore why, and the responses were multifaceted. One major hurdle is systemic and relates to broader political systems of allocating value to certain types of activities and outcomes, but not others. More reflection is needed on the power plays that underpin colliding economies of work in urban settings, to use the terminology of French sociologists Boltanski and Thévenot. The persistent undervaluing of social and environmental quality in the face of commercial enterprise and the underplaying of social innovation. Such activities require attention to higher level leverage points, that is, to the distribution of power over the rules of the system, the goals of the system, and the mindsets or paradigms out of which the system and its goals, power structures, rules and cultures arises. However, we also found the impacts are often invisible, and we have tried to do something tangible about this and have worked with and for food sharing initiatives to make their impacts more visible, and this led to the development of the Shareit platform. Shareit is an online and free-to-use platform supporting food sharing initiatives to identify, document, communicate and reflect on their sustainability goals and impacts in multiple ways. It's made of three core elements: the tool shed, which contains indicators, both qualitative and quantitative reporting options, including specific indicators to capture the impacts of collaborative activities. The talent garden, which provides a space where initiatives can post impact narratives, images and videos, which don't fit easily within the preset toolshed framework. And the greenhouse, which provides a portal through which food sharing initiatives can connect and share experiences and learn from each other. The prototype we co-produced with food sharing initiatives is up and running. We've been testing it with a pilot group with positive feedback and some room for improvement identified. We hope to gain further support to revise the tool in the light of these findings, and we're currently rolling it out in a designated smart district within Dublin as part of the Enable Smart City project funded by Science Foundation Ireland. One of my team, Alwyn McGeever, is presenting our work on this later today at the conference if you'd like to find out more. However, while Shareit can be used autonomously, there is still back-end work to be done to manage users and maintain the platform. So the question for us now is, how should we ensure that this tool itself is sustainable, particularly in the light of our desire not to burden already strapped food sharing initiatives with additional costs? We've participated in a feasibility study for Shareit with local authority personnel, networks of local authorities and commercial retailers. This led to some interesting, if not particularly positive, results. Each actor we spoke to acknowledged the need for and value in Shareit. However, in the absence of mandatory sustainability reporting requirements for local authorities, with limited regulatory incentives in many places for retailers to take on the responsibility and associated costs for tracking the impacts that food donations make to sustainability, none of these actors felt willing or able to support Shareit's maintenance and use. As one respondent said, we're ahead of the market with Shareit. Certainly, significant change is required in terms of placing sustainability at the centre of systems transitions, and this has to move from rhetoric to reality in practical and physical terms. We require an overhaul of economic and financial systems. To illustrate this case in point, during our research, it was revealed that one supermarket donating food to a redistribution initiative was only covering 20% of the cost of redistributing that food, approximately €125,000 per year. This was an additional 20% more than it would have cost the retailer to dispose of the food through existing waste collection. But it's also worth noting that the retailer spent 30 million on a 30-second advertising campaign, which flagged the scale of its donations to this charity. So it's hard to stomach such calculations in the face of persistent hunger and food insecurity, of urban loneliness and anomie. But as a despairing optimist, I'm now exploring other mechanisms for sustainably resourcing Shareit alongside other leverage points for supporting sustainability transitions. So how should we move forward in the face of current geographies of hunger and increasingly urgent risks to food security related to climate change, biodiversity, and the pandemic. Given the persistence of a system which supports and promotes the kinds of practices which are creating the relevant challenges we face. I could simply grieve for the lost opportunity around sustainable food sharing for urban food resilience and bemoan the seemingly intractable nature of the flawed systems we inhabit, which are perpetuating unsustainable practices. On one level, this would be understandable, and according to Leslie Head in her book, Hope and Grief in the Anthropocene, might even engender collective capacities and mobilize newfound resources. Yet, as her book also implies, grief alone is insufficient. It's vital to also create space for hope, not through empty promises of optimism, which ask us to have faith in the future, but rather that we seek out and enact what Head calls the gritty, keeping going kind of hope. This form of hope is conceived both as a disposition to the world and a set of practices to be exercised and experienced, and from which necessary disappointments also flow. The grief we feel is not something we can get beyond, she suggests. It has to become part of our lives and politics. Hope then is about the potential for things to be otherwise. And as Harriet Bulkley said in relation to climate change, to have hope is to work with the understanding that the future has capacity to be changed and that it remains open in the face of what might appear to be foregone conclusions. I'd argue the same holds true for sustainable food futures, and following Mike Hume, we need ways to work with and not silo out facts, values, and imagination. We also need spaces of experimenting with doing things differently, and this is what we are currently doing with the follow-on research from Shareit, where we're experimenting with novel visualizations that I showed earlier, and alternative means to communicate sustainability impacts through Shareit. We're hoping this experimentation will better enable policymakers and agents of all kinds to step outside of what is constituted as their business as usual role in cities and associated socio-technical systems, while retaining their identities and modes of operation. Food sharing initiatives, we believe, provide counter sites in which both the future alternative and present mainstream are coincident. These sites are not focused on understanding, managing, and living with nature, but are focused more on materialist, relational, and pragmatic encounters. So to conclude, it's accepting grief and with hope that I move forward to move from recovery to resilience today. Hope that we can collectively shift the current allocation of values and cognizant of the massive tasks that's still left to address. I'm hopeful that the principles of Shareit Manifesto will help stimulate further dialogue, deliberation, and ultimately action, and not just in relation to food sharing activities, but also more broadly in relation to developing more sustainable food systems. So I'm channeling Audrey Hepburn here in that I'm ready to plant a garden because I do believe in tomorrow. Just mean to not pick the flowers. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Anna. That was really, really interesting. Thank you so much for telling us about the Shareit project. So I've got two questions myself, and there's been a question in the chat as well. So I'll start with the ones that I've got. So food sharing seems like this kind of, perhaps not really new, but this novel kind of practice and activity that's being put forward as being really critical moving forward with solving community issues related to food, etc. But it seems that it has three actors, and you spoke about some of the challenges in your presentation. So the role of local government and policy, etc. The role of community in this, and also the private sector as well. So we're hearing from Jamie after this around apps like Too Good To Go that share food. So it's almost a question of how does this move forward? Is there one specific kind of blockage there that needs to kind of be resolved to move forward with this, or is it more of a kind of collective action that will help us in terms of development?
Thanks, John. Yeah, that's an interesting and quite complicated question. I guess I suppose to start from the beginning, food sharing was really a term that we used in this project. I don't know whether it's a particularly widely used term, other than potentially in association with the kind of platform activities which are often in the media associated with Uber and things like that. We did include those kinds of for-profit platform type sharing activities, mainly to explore the different business model and what that meant for the acts of sharing. However, we predominantly focused on non-mainstream models, which I guess you could argue that those food sharing platforms also included. And it was a means to try and look at these as a collective body of activities. Now, people would, in everyday lives, be much more familiar with like community gardens or community kitchens or surplus food redistribution initiatives. And we thought that they had some kind of common elements. So it's probably quite academic to talk about them as food sharing rather than necessarily promoting that as a category for policy. But I think what it does quite usefully in discussions with policymakers is that it brings to the fore the collaborative acts that we see as central to the perhaps uniqueness of that. And collaboration, not just in the means of exchange, commercial exchange, but in terms of other forms of interaction that practice engenders, which has the potential, but which isn't always achieved, that has that potential to do things differently from the predominant kind of mainstream commercial road. And just to answer the second part of your question quickly, I don't think that there is a silver bullet like many of these sort of systems challenges. We really need to look at things in the round, hence the baker's dozen of the principles of the manifesto. There were many others potentially that could have got in there as well. I think that it's a case of operationalizing multiple leverage points. I think Donella Meadows' work, 20 odd years old at this stage, is still relevant here in terms of recognizing that there are multiple leverage points to try and change systems. And while a lot of the work seems to take place at kind of the bottom end of tweaking with taxes and things like that, we do also need to address the bigger kind of mindsets and power play aspects that are endemic in the food systems that we have. So I hope that answers your question a bit, Jordan.
Yeah, it does. And that kind of murky nature of what food sharing is and how it's being kind of put forward in the media is really interesting at the moment. So my second question related to almost how does this record and what's the impact of it? So food sharing is having this kind of really huge environmental, social benefits, but a lot of it seems kind of convivial. It's in the community, etc. As you said. So in what ways, perhaps, of your project has helped kind of evidence this, or kind of bring it to light to make it to make others aware of how important it is? Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I mean, that was the real motivation behind the Shareit toolkit in some ways, which we worked with a range of food sharing initiatives internationally to build that, to try and meet their needs. But because of the diversity of that cohort, it's very difficult to do that in a way which meets everyone's needs. But I think we thought, although there are problems with trying to particularly quantify these aspects, which I think your question is kind of getting at, a lot of the qualities that are created through the acts of sharing are not easily put into quantitative figures to enter into any kind of formal sustainability impact assessment. And so we tried to move away from that while also including it so that we could talk in the language of those who might be interested in or using these reports that are generated through the toolkit for making decisions about funding, making decisions about land tenure and things like that. So we try to cover all bases, I guess, at some level. And we're also very clear that there are criticisms of unvalidated impact, self-reported impact assessments and the potential for greenwashing. Now, we didn't come across that as a potential concern with a lot of the community-based organisations that we worked with, but clearly with sort of more commercial operators, that is certainly a risk that needs to be taken heed of. I think one of the interesting things is that you mentioned that they make a huge contribution. Now, absolutely, they make a huge contribution to those who participate and those who are surrounding those activities that may see them and may be visible to them. But the challenge is that they're distributed impacts. And our experience with policymakers in particular is that they're still seeking that silver bullet. They still want the big hits, the big wins in terms of, say, emissions reductions. And in the context of local authorities are often driven by the current sort of policy priorities, in which case in the Irish context, for example, it is about reducing emissions. So when they come to us and say, oh yeah, we're really interested to see what difference that food sharing makes, then they see the kind of, I suppose, small contributions that each individual makes. But I say you need to see this in the aggregate. And it's interesting, I always think that, in this digital age, with the capacities of ICT, but also artificial intelligence, all the other things, that these kinds of distributed benefits aren't better sort of taken into consideration. The systems that we're creating with information technology these days are absolutely able to deal with that, but still they seem to want the kind of clean data, the easily accessible data, rather than using these sophisticated technologies to really grapple with the difficult data, which I'd really love them to engage with. So I think that there are a couple of dimensions to that for sure.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. It's yeah. The fact that you're talking about how it's difficult to kind of quantify the impact of that and is really interesting, and that's definitely a challenge I think for a lot of I'm going to call them more sustainable practices, but behaviour change, etc. research in the area of food. So I'm going to move on to John's question that posted in the chat, and I'll read the whole comment. So an economic system that still measures progress according to GDP, sharing seems like a radical act. Sharing often doesn't involve receipts like transactions do. How do you think sharing should be measured at a scale to demonstrate the values it demonstrates, or should we even measure sharing activity? So similar point there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it was a concern of ours that we didn't want to discipline food sharing initiatives for the very work that they're doing, certainly not in terms of burdening them with additional responsibilities, but also the fear or concern that these kind of distributed benefits might lead to the, I suppose, dismissal, say, community gardening locality, because its impacts in isolation are both multifaceted, but also potentially quite small. But it is the collection of those and the accessibility of those as for the whole population that creates the significant benefits. So we were very cognizant that there are dangers also in trying to measure. And certainly I would have long-standing concerns, for example, around the use of natural capital as a means to engage economists in their own game without seeking to change that game at its fundamental level. So we are stuck, in this kind of liminal zone between a system that is clearly flawed and where multiple stakeholders are calling for radical change, but also they call for feasible responses that work with the system that needs to be changed. And our kind of goal or visualizations of what would create a sustainable future, and trying to sort of operate across both of those, opening up, not closing down, and certainly not disciplining those sort of, potentially what we would call like sort of maybe unexceptional politics in the form of community activities, but nonetheless extremely important at the grassroots level. So I mean, I'm constantly sort of reflecting on my own kind of drives here. I absolutely want these activities, actions and impacts to be visible. I do want them to be more visible. I do want them to be taken into account. And that requires, I think, a change in mindset across the system. And of course, that's going to take time. And we can start maybe from the bottom, but certainly it does need to be supported from nations and international scales as well. I think that they're really kind of demonstration activities of alternative possible futures. I think I mentioned that at the end of my presentation, this notion that they can be both in the present and quite radical in the future. So in that regard, I'm just very keen that these kinds of organisations, where they're demonstrated to be sustainable, and I would have to say that we've learned of some quite disheartening kind of shifts with COVID, with the food sharing initiatives in Dublin in particular, where there's been an increase in kind of informal food sharing as a means to respond to the crisis and food insecurity that is generated. But also we've heard anecdotally of cases where these kinds of activities have been hijacked by less desirable activities. So money laundering, money lending, drug dealing, all of these kinds of things, which have emerged in and alongside the more formal and embedded community type activities. So it's clear that food sharing is not a silver bullet, nor is it necessarily by itself sustainable, and that there does need to be some kind of reflection on the kinds of activities and the impacts that they create.
Yeah, but at the same time, food sharing is something that communities can organise themselves around, or it can kind of push that organisation as well. It sounds like. Okay, so we'll keep going with questions in the chat. So from David Beck, what's your biggest source of hope?
Was working actually on the ground, getting my hands dirty, working with community gardeners and talking to them and talking to those people who run community kitchens. Being actually involved in the process gives me hope, because you can, as an academic in particular, get caught up in intensely theoretical discussions around how things might be done better, and I absolutely enjoy those and find them really stimulating. But the hope really comes from the ground and from working with these organisations, and inspired by the activities of those who not only sort of initiate and maintain them, who are inspirational in and of themselves, but also those that come along and volunteer, that themselves sort of seeking out these kinds of activities. And we worked with some young people in a pilot with our visualizations, and we got them to write a day in the life story, stimulated by the scenario that they were looking at. And some of their insights and thoughts were just really brilliant, and these young people that we worked with are the future, and so that gives me hope. Certainly, it's hard to reflect on the past, I suppose, 25 years of my academic career or so, and think that we're still having very similar conversations that I had when I was doing my PhD. So that can be a little bit despairing, but I think that there has been in the way that these issues are being discussed in the media, and by young people and people on the street. So that certainly does give me hope.
Great. It's interesting to hear about kind of being in the field. I suppose as being an academic, being a researcher, it's so exciting to be out there researching what's happening. In my case, food waste and speaking to people, etc. That kind of spark you get from every research project. So another question in the chat from Lopa. In the context of increased marginalisation from certain groups and digital inequalities on top of other inequalities, will the focus on IT mediated food sharing turn out to be less inclusive? And where does social inclusion fit in?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, from the purposes of the research that we did, we used ICT for two main reasons. One was to bound the study in some way, and also because of the international aspirations of the study, it was easiest for us to find the digital traces of organisations that had some ICT presence, although we were very expansive in our understanding of ICT. So these things come from Facebook groups, for example, right up to redistribution apps. But it is an important point. Lots of the initiatives that we worked with were both on and offline. Some of them only used the kind of online Facebook groups to organise themselves or to communicate activities that they were undertaking, and their work on the ground was very much focused on inclusivity with the local communities. Indeed, some of them were specifically set up for particular types of communities, whether that be intercultural gardens in Berlin or kitchens in London, which were bringing in local communities to demonstrate cooking and to include people in that way. So I'm not promoting, I guess, ICT food sharing as the future, more the reality that many food sharing initiatives now do have some presence. And we were interested to see how they were using that ICT format, and also then how that made, or what difference it made, if any, to the activities that they were doing. And for many, it wasn't a huge part of their work. It was part of their everyday life. But yeah, as the question suggests, not everyone has a smartphone to interact with these groups, and that's certainly something to be careful of. In Dublin 8, where we're doing some follow-on work currently with the rollout with Shareit, we've mapped both on and offline sharing, because we have the capacity to do so in quite a small place. And there are certainly about, out of the 30 that we found in just this small district in Dublin, inner city Dublin, 8 of them don't have an online presence currently. So I think the activities that go on the ground are quite similar, whether they're ICT or non-ICT mediated. But I think the role that ICT can play, and in particular, we found it a useful means to connect through the Shareit IT tool, for example, but we're fully aware that does mean that some people are not able to engage with looking at alternative mechanisms around it, support services. But of course, we need to work out how we can do that.
Yeah, I feel with the kind of ICT side, it's a double-edged sword, because at the same time you've got, everyone has a phone now, we can be so connected, but reading some of George Monbiot's work, there's a kind of downside that being kind of engaged with our phones, etc., and television, etc., kind of made us more isolated in some respects, and we're not kind of going out into communities as much. But thank you. So is there any final questions from anyone else? So we'll have one final question if there is one, and then we'll leave it there. I don't think there's any more in the chat. Okay.
So just to say thanks then, Jordan, thanks to everyone for attending, and I'd be very interested to hear about the work that you're doing, Jordan, at some point down the line with the food waste, and yeah, it'd be great to keep in contact.
Well, thank you for being a keynote speaker today. It's really interesting. Thank you for presenting.
Okay, thanks very much.
Great.
Have a good day.
Thank you.